Start. Greetings. My name is Lucia Nunez, and I'm the Vice President of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. And given that this is my first online course, I hope you'll bear with me as I'm not used to speaking to a screen, but rather having a room full of people in their faces. For this section of this online course, we're going to work on the for this section on for the online course, we're going to focus on the brain and bias. I want you to think about incorporating your head. Let me start all over again. Let me start all over again. Okay. Greetings. My name is Lucia Nunez. I'm the Vice President of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. I hope you'll bear with me since this is my first online course, and so I'm not used to looking at a computer screen and talking to a microphone, but rather having a room full of people and their faces and their reactions. So this will be a new experience for me. For this section of the online course, we're going to focus on the brain and for this section of the online course, we're going to focus on the brain and bias. I want to ask you to think holistically, incorporating your head, your heart, and your hands. I understand we all have comfort zones, not just the way we think, but with whom we interact, what we express publicly, how we express ourselves. But the beauty of an online course is that you have the opportunity to push yourself out of that comfort zone. Give yourself permission to do so. The images that will appear on the screen of the heart, the head, and the hands will hopefully serve as reminders to you to again push yourself beyond your comfort zone. Explore those interactions of how you feel, how you're thinking, and what you're doing, because that's all part of becoming much more aware of the biases that we all hold and how our brain and body work together to kind of keep that information and express that information. So be very aware of those areas. During this course, we'll think about the brain. We'll also talk about what bias is, and we'll go through a series of exercises to really challenge your brain and the way you think. And then I'll leave you with 3 actions to really think about in terms of how to break bias, how to reduce bias. The brain. We know that the brain weighs about 3 pounds. It's not a large organ, but it is one of the start all over again. The brain. We know the brain weighs about 3 pounds. We also know that plasticity is the ability to form new neural connections. Intense mental training can change the structure and function of the brain. We've seen a lot of research with stroke victims of how they're able to relearn to talk, to walk, and that's an example of how the body and the brain can work on mental training to change the structure and function of the brain. We know that during the first weeks of life, a baby utters almost every sound of every known language. Later, the ability to make some sounds vanishes, which is the case for neural pruning. The images you see of a brain and showing the brain development and how over the course of the first 10 years of life, the brain does have that ability to add new areas and grow. So this is all new in terms of brain research. Our brains process 11 million pieces of information. The next 2 facts I really want you to keep in mind as we think about bias. So our brain, working with our bodies, with our different systems, we're breathing without thinking about it. Our hearts are beating without thinking about it. Our nervous system, there's tons of messages being sent to different parts of our body that we don't know about. We're not conscious of those things. Consciously, we're aware of about 40 pieces of information per second. And there's some people who would challenge this, some people who really say it's probably less. But consciously, we're aware of maybe what the gender of somebody is that comes in our view, what color shirt they might be wearing, what environment, what the climate might be. Is it hot? Is it cold in a room? We're not aware of many things at any given point. The primitive brain, that part of the brain that really works on just primitive and reactions that, again, we're not even conscious of. So if we are fearful of something, might we fight, or would we freeze, or would we run? That area is in the primitive part of our brain, and some of our biases exist in that area. So how we react to somebody that we don't know, or that we may not be able to, may never have interacted with, might be at this level. So let's go through some definitions of bias. Bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, a person, or a group that compared to with another, but usually considered to be unfair. Explicit bias, we're not going to deal much with the explicit bias, but those are attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions and decisions in a conscious manner. So we're aware of these. I don't like this type of person. I don't like, I'm not comfortable with women, or I'm not comfortable with men. Those are the things we're aware of. But it's the implicit bias that I really want to focus on. And those are those attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions and decision in an unconscious manner. These biases, both favorable and unfavorable, are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. Keep that in mind. This is activated. These are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. I bring up identity because that's important, especially in equity and inclusion work and diversity work. We all have identity. We all have distinguishing characteristics or personalities, or things that make us different or the same. Many times in diversity work, it's diversity is them, it's people of color, it's women. But actually, in terms of equity and inclusion work, identity, we all have identities. And it's important to keep that in mind to eliminate and reduce that us versus them dichotomy. The levels of bias work at three different levels: that individual level, the institutional, those places we work, government, businesses, churches, schools, and the structural. The structural is that combination of businesses, institutions, as well as that history. So, for example, an individual may be homophobic. They are not comfortable with gays and lesbians. They do not agree with people being gays and lesbians. They may even act against individuals that are gays and lesbians. But it's an individual or series of individuals that work at institutions that together may pass policies or practices against that group of people, those individuals, and in groups that identify as LGBTQ. So those institutions, such as churches that won't marry gay same-sex partners, and even until recently, institutions such as governments that didn't recognize same-sex marriage. And then it's the history and the combination of all those institutions at the structural level that have kept LGBT community oppressed. Not just state governments, but federal governments that didn't recognize same-sex partnerships. So it's all of these working together like the gears in a machine to keep those levels of oppression and levels of bias operating at multiple levels. So let's think about breaking your brain. And I take that quote from someone who participated in a face-to-face diversity training, We Are Madison College diversity training, when she really experienced one of the activities that I'll show you later on and said, wow, this is like breaking our brain. So one of the games is really thinking about how our brain works. So let me take you through this. Take time to go through this. So step one, think about a number between 2 and 8. Don't, well, that's not relevant. Don't say it or share it with anyone. Just write it down. Take your time to do that. Step two, multiply this number by 9. Don't be intimidated by the math of this. This is fairly simple. So just take the number and multiply by 9. You can use a calculator if you need to. Now add these two digits together, meaning if you took the number 2 multiplied by 9, you'd get 18. So add those two digits together. 1 plus 8 equals 9. Now subtract 5 from your answer. So again, back to my example. If 9 was my number, in the last step, I subtract 5 from it, I would get 4. So take the time to do that. Now, step 5, associate your number with a letter from the alphabet. So if you have the number 1, you get the letter A, number 2, B, 3, C, 4, D, and so forth. So associate your number that you got in the last step with a letter from the alphabet. Are you ready? Now, think of a country that begins with that letter. Think of an animal where the first letter of the animal's name is the last letter of the country's name. So let me see if I had the country Cuba, the last letter of Cuba is A, and an animal that starts with the letter A would be an alligator. Step 8, think of a color where the first letter of the color's name is the last letter of the animal's name. So if alligator was my animal, the last letter in alligator would be R, and I would choose red. Are we ready? So did you get Denmark, kangaroo, and orange? Why do you think that happened? In the majority of times that I've done the Denmark kangaroo orange exercise, the majority of people tend to get Denmark. I'd say 75 to 90% of people in any audience that I've done get Denmark. And then that sort of leads to the other. Kangaroo or koala are about the only K animals that I know of. And then obviously it depends on the orange. But the reason I ask why is that many times the reasons we all think alike, the majority of people pick Denmark, is because our context is very similar. So we may not get information about Dominica or Dominican Republic or Djibouti in Africa. So Denmark is that first immediate reaction and immediate answer to this question. What country starts with the letter D? And it isn't that we have bias against any of the other countries, Dominica. It's that our context sometimes controls how and what we think, rather than allowing us to expand our thinking. This is another example, we actually have one of these bikes. I encourage you to take the chance to take and look at this YouTube video. Smarter Every Day is a series that comes up on YouTube that really challenges people to think about it. And the backwards bike is another way to challenge your brain. If you do want to ride this bike, if you're interested in looking at this and seeing what this does, and how it challenges your brain to think in a new way, how your physical body and your brain works, and how that works also in terms of bias. You're welcome to come by my office. We have a version of the backwards bike, and you're welcome to try it out. So again, I encourage you to take a look at this YouTube video by Smarter Every Day, and if you have a chance, come by and ride the bike, backwards bike. This is a version of a strobe test, and I want you to take a look at the words on here and say the color of the word. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to just go through this. Again, say the color of the word. Now say the color of the word again. See if this works. Try it again now. Does this make it easier to say the color of the word? How about now? Is it easier now to say the color of the word? Not read the word, but rather say the color of the word. What is your brain doing here in this last exercise? There's two parts of what your brain is doing. One of them is trying to read the word. The other is trying to recognize the color. And sometimes our brains don't want to cooperate. It's easier when the words are written upside down or in different, so you're not looking so much at the letters and trying to read what the word is, but rather you're just looking at the color. Also, it's easier to do it in a different language. This is all Spanish, so for some of you it might be very familiar, but for others that don't know any Spanish, it might be easier to just concentrate on the color rather than the word. Again, testing your brain in a way, that's also what how we become much more aware of what biases we might have, and how do we challenge our brains when we become aware of those biases. The last exercise, oops, I'm going in the wrong direction, I apologize. The last exercise, I think many of you have heard of this, Project Implicit out of Harvard University. Take a test, take a couple of tests. Here's the website that you can go to. I encourage you, again, in the privacy of your own home, to be able to take a couple of these tests. They don't take a long time. Sometimes it's helpful to take it a couple of times. You'll again see maybe what your reactions are, what your brain wants to do versus what you want to believe in. There's some information about Project Implicit, when it was founded, and some of the research that comes out of this. I think, again, it's helpful to, in that awareness, to become aware of what our biases are, and then again, how do we challenge our biases to be able to reduce what the biases, become aware, especially what happens if we're invited to be part of an interview panel. How do we challenge ourselves to be open to all the candidates that come in, regardless not just of their color of their skin, of their gender, but perhaps other things that we may not necessarily be so aware of. Someone's disability, accents, things that are a little bit more hidden, but that somehow we get clues and our brain starts reacting to it, our bodies start to reacting to it, and we're not aware of why. Again, this is something to think about, not just in your personal world, in your community, but also in the classroom. How do you increase awareness? How do you challenge yourself once you become aware of biases that you might have? And then you have to constantly repeat this process and this cycle. You can't just assume that because you've become aware, you've taken courses, you've challenged yourself in a variety of different ways, that you have evolved. You've got to constantly repeat this cycle in order to change, kind of again back to change the structure and what exists in your brains. You've got to constantly be working on it. It's like exercise. You've got to develop new muscle to be able to then become more proficient in this area. So I encourage you to do this. I know that you'll have journal exercises throughout this. One of them that I'd encourage you to think about in terms of bias is do a great deal of reflection. Be honest in your reflections. That's the hardest part in this, because politically we are so intent on being politically correct that sometimes we squelch what exists and what our honest reactions are. So have time to do honest reflection, act on those reflections, think about what you need to do to change perhaps some of the biases that are operating, and then think about the impact that you have, especially as faculty. What impact do you have in the classroom? Do you call on certain people more than others? Just because maybe they do raise their hand, but who is raising their hand, and who isn't? Who's participating in other ways and who isn't? How do you react to certain students, and how maybe do you treat other students that don't fall into the typical good student box? How do you engage others? Are there names that are easier to pronounce than others? And you need to work on that. So you may remember some student's name, but others you may not. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to show that vulnerability, and keep this process going. So I hope and encourage you in your journals to do that reflection, action, and impact, and constantly keep that process going. Thank you. And again, I hope you reach out to me. This is the first online course that I've ever participated in. So please do. I welcome feedback, and I welcome exchanges and conversations about any part of this presentation. Thank you.